The official story seems straightforward. Josef Stalin, the iron-fisted dictator who ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades, died on March 5, 1953 from a cerebral hemorrhage. But what if I told you that the truth behind his final hours is far more sinister than the Soviet propaganda machine ever admitted? The night of February 28, 1953, started like any other at Stalin's Kuntsevo dacha outside Moscow. The aging dictator gathered with his inner circle. Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin for dinner and a late-night film screening. They drank heavily, as was customary, and did not leave until the early morning hours of March 1st. But here is where the story takes its first dark turn. Stalin's guards were under strict orders never to disturb him unless he called for them. So when the entire day of March 1st passed without any sign of the Soviet leader, no one dared enter his rooms, not even when night fell again. The man who held absolute power over millions was lying helpless somewhere in his quarters, and his terrified staff simply waited outside. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the Soviet Union possibly dying while his guards stood frozen by fear just meters away. 10 p.m. on March 1st. Nearly 18 hours after he was last seen, a guard finally found the courage to investigate. What he discovered would become one of the most controversial moments in Soviet history. Stalin was lying on the floor of his bedroom, wearing his pajama bottoms soaked in his own urine. He was conscious but could not speak or move his right arm and his right leg. The stroke had already done its damage. But here's what most people do not know. Despite finding their leader in this desperate state, the guards did not immediately call for doctors. Why? Because they were terrified of making the wrong decision. Beria had created such an atmosphere of paranoia that even saving Stalin's life seemed risky. The guard who found Stalin was named Pyotr Lozgachev, and his testimony years later revealed something shocking. When he discovered Stalin, he immediately called the dacha staff, but they refused to contact anyone from the Central Committee without authorization. They spent precious hours debating what to do, each person too terrified to take responsibility. This was not incompetence. This was the logical result of decades of terror, where any decision could mean death. When Stalin's inner circle finally arrived hours later, around 3 a.m. on March 2nd, Beria's behavior became even more suspicious. According to witnesses, he was almost gleeful, making jokes and showing no concern for Stalin's condition. Khrushchev later wrote in his memoirs that Beria could not hide his excitement, saying it was as if he had been waiting for this moment. When Beria first saw Stalin lying helpless, he reportedly said, "Comrades, he's sleeping peacefully. Let's not disturb him." And he actually tried to delay medical intervention even further. But as soon as Beria left the room, he allegedly turned to the others with a completely different expression, one of triumph. This Jekyll and Hyde performance raises an unsettling question. Was Beria playing both sides, pretending to care while ensuring Stalin would not survive? Now here's where the conspiracy deepens. Medical help did not arrive until nearly 9 a.m. on March 2nd, almost a full day after Stalin was found. The delay was blamed on the difficulty of finding doctors, but there was a chilling reason why. Stalin himself had just ordered the arrest of the Kremlin's best physicians, had been accused in the infamous doctors' plot, charged with trying to assassinate Soviet leaders. Most of those doctors were Jewish, accused of plotting to poison the Soviet leadership. The supreme irony. The paranoid dictator who saw assassins everywhere had eliminated the very doctors who might have saved his life. The doctors who finally arrived were second-rate and terrified. They knew that if Stalin died under their care, they would likely be executed as saboteurs. If he lived but remained incapacitated, they might be blamed for not doing enough. It was an impossible situation. Professor Lukomsky, one of the attending physicians, later described the atmosphere as nightmarish, with Beria constantly lurking nearby, watching their every move. When doctors finally examined Stalin, they found him in critical condition, with sky-high blood pressure and significant brain damage. But their treatment was strangely passive. They administered leeches, a medieval remedy, rather than aggressive modern interventions. They gave him magnesium sulfate and some other basic medications, but nothing that would be considered cutting-edge treatment even by 1953 standards. Some historians argue this was because Soviet medicine was genuinely backward. Others whisper a darker theory. Perhaps certain people wanted to ensure Stalin would not recover. One particularly disturbing detail: the medical bulletins issued during Stalin's illness were written not by doctors but by Beria's people. The physicians would examine Stalin, but then NKVD officers would take their notes and edit them before release. What was being hidden? What did the real medical records say? For 4 agonizing days, Stalin lingered between life and death while his lieutenants circled like vultures, already dividing power among themselves. Witnesses described horrifying scenes: Stalin's face turning dark purple, his breathing labored and gasping, his eyes showing absolute terror as he realized he was dying and powerless to stop it. The man who had never shown mercy was receiving none himself. Stalin's daughter Svetlana Alliluyeva was brought to see her father during his final hours. Her account is heartbreaking and terrifying in equal measure. She described how her father would occasionally regain partial consciousness, his eyes wild with fear and confusion. He seemed to recognize people but could not speak. At one point, he appeared to be trying to point at something on the wall. Was it a clock showing him how much time he had left? Or was he pointing accusingly at the portraits of Lenin and Marx as if blaming the revolution that had consumed him? In one particularly haunting moment, Stalin briefly regained consciousness on March 5th, looked around at the faces surrounding his deathbed, Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, Bulganin, and others, raised his left hand as if pointing at them or perhaps cursing them. According to Svetlana, the last gesture was incomprehensible and full of menace. Then he fell back dead at 9:50 p.m. But the most explosive revelation came decades later. In 2003, on the 50th anniversary of Stalin's death, new evidence emerged suggesting that Stalin might not have died from natural causes at all. According to those accounts, documented in memoirs and historical investigations, Lavrenti Beria later boasted to Vyacheslav Molotov that he had poisoned Stalin. Beria allegedly used warfarin, a colorless, tasteless anticoagulant poison that causes internal bleeding and strokes, symptoms perfectly consistent with Stalin's final illness. Warfarin is particularly insidious because it does not kill immediately. It builds up in the system over several days or weeks, gradually preventing blood from clotting normally. This can lead to internal bleeding, including bleeding in the brain, exactly what Stalin experienced. Even more damning, warfarin was readily available. In the Soviet Union in 1953, warfarin, primarily a rat poison, was available, and Beria, as head of the secret police, had access to the Soviet Union's most sophisticated poisons through Laboratory 12, a secret facility dedicated to developing untraceable toxins. The motive was crystal clear. Stalin was planning another massive purge, and Beria was almost certainly on the list. Documents discovered after the Soviet Union's collapse revealed that Stalin had been preparing to eliminate his closest associates, just as he had done repeatedly throughout his reign. The so-called doctor's plot was just the beginning. Stalin had been making ominous comments about enemies within and had started compiling lists of officials to be arrested. Khrushchev later revealed that during that final, at the dinner on February 28th, Stalin was in a particularly dark mood, making veiled threats and talking about enemies close to the throne. Several of the men present believed they were being set up for arrest. Did they collectively decide that night that killing Stalin was the only way to save themselves? Was the poison administered during that final meal? Consider this chilling fact: not a single complete autopsy report was ever made public. For a leader of Stalin's importance, this absence is staggering. What were they hiding? The Soviet government released only the vaguest details about the cause of death, claiming medical confidentiality. That came from a dictator who had never respected anyone's privacy or confidentiality in his life. He had controlled every aspect of his life. Why suddenly become protective of medical records for a dead man? The limited medical information that was released stated Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage, but conveniently omitted details about what might have caused it. In cases of suspicious death, determining whether a hemorrhage was spontaneous or induced by anticoagulants is crucial, but this question was never publicly addressed. Even more suspicious, Beria was arrested in June 1953, just 3 months after Stalin's death, and executed in December of that same year, supposedly for treason, espionage, and terrorism. The charges were almost certainly fabricated. Beria was a monster, but probably not guilty of the specific crimes he was accused of. But was his execution really about justice, or was it about silencing the one man who knew the truth about how Stalin died? Dead men tell no tales, after all. Khrushchev, who orchestrated Beria's arrest and execution, had every reason to want him silenced. If Beria had poisoned Stalin, Khrushchev and the others were either accomplices or knew about it and did nothing. Either way, Beria alive was a liability. The speed of his trial and execution, highly unusual even by Soviet standards, suggests panic among the remaining leadership. The physical evidence raises further questions. Some historians and forensic experts who have studied the available medical records note that Stalin's symptoms, the sudden onset, the specific pattern of paralysis, the rapid deterioration despite his These symptoms in a robust 74-year-old are more consistent with poisoning than with a spontaneous natural stroke. Warfarin poisoning, to which Beria had access through his control of Soviet laboratories and poison facilities, would have been virtually undetectable with 1953 medical technology. Moreover, Stalin had survived the incredibly stressful years of World War II without any major health crises. Yes, he was 74 and had atherosclerosis, but his sudden collapse seemed almost too convenient for his potential victims. Some medical historians have pointed out that if Stalin had been gradually poisoned with warfarin starting perhaps a week or two before his collapse, it would explain the sudden severity of the hemorrhage and the difficulty doctors had in stabilizing him. There's another detail that often gets overlooked. After Stalin's death, there was a mysterious purge of everyone who had been present during his final days. Guards were reassigned to remote posts. Some of the medical staff disappeared into the Gulag system. The dacha where Stalin died was quickly demolished. It is as if someone wanted to erase all evidence and witnesses. Why go to such lengths if there was nothing to hide? So what really happened in that dacha? Did Stalin die from natural causes, hastened by medical neglect and the terror system he himself created? Or was he murdered by the very men he had trusted with power, who decided the monster they had helped create needed to be destroyed before he destroyed them? The truth may never be fully known. Soviet records remain partially sealed, and many key witnesses took their secrets to the grave. But one thing is certain. The death of Josef Stalin was as mysterious and paranoid as the life he led. The man who had orchestrated the deaths of millions died alone on a floor, his guards too afraid to help him, his doctors either unable or unwilling to save him, surrounded by colleagues who may have wanted him dead. Perhaps that is the ultimate irony of Stalin's story. The architect of the Great Terror became a victim of the very system of fear he created. He had taught everyone around him that survival meant eliminating threats before they eliminated you. In the end, they may have simply learned his lesson too well.